I'm going to do a demo on how to deploy Windows 11 using Microsoft Deployment Toolkit and Windows Deployment Server. To start, I've got a clean install Windows Server 2022, which has been added to the domain and nothing else done to it so far. To start, I am going to install the Windows Deployment Services role. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and select Windows Deployment Services and then Add Feature. Then next, select both the deployment and transport server, and then press next and install. While that's installing, we can download the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit and the Windows 11 ADKs. So if we just search for Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, and then go to the first Microsoft link, and then download the Deployment Toolkit. This current version is 8456, just download the latest version that is available, and then get the 64-bit version. We also need to get the Windows 11 ADK, so if we just search for Windows 11 ADK, and then download and install the Windows ADK. Now what we need to do is we need to download the ADK for Windows 11 as well as the Windows PE add-on. So if we just select that one and then select the second one, and they will automatically download. Once that's downloaded, the installation should have succeeded for Windows Deployment Services, which it has, so we can just close that for the time being. And then go to the Downloads folder, and we should have the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, the ADK setup, and the ADK WinPE setup. To start, we will just install the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit and just hit next through all of the configuration settings and then finish. Then we need to do the ADK setup and then the ADK WinPE setup. I've already downloaded all of the files because they're quite big, but the installation process is exactly the same. Just basically hit next. Don't select to collect insights, and then just next and leave all of the settings as default. Once the ADK is finished installing, just press close and then go back and install the WinPE ADK, and again just use all the default settings. Next, accept, and then install. Now that's all finished, we can start deploying Windows 11. So to start, if you go back to Server Manager and then go to Tools and then Windows Deployment Services. In here we can expand servers and then configure our deployment server. Just right click and press configure, then do next. For this example we are integrating with Active Directory, so hit next. And then give it a path for the remote install. Ideally, if you would have a data drive and you would just install it on that, but it works fine just using it on the C drive. It's just an error to say that it's best to have it on a separate volume, but I'm just going to continue anyway. For the Pixie server settings, we'll just tell it to respond to all client computers, and then next. And now we've got our deployment share. I'm just going to untick the add images because we will do that later. And that's all we need to do for the Windows deployment server at the moment. So we'll minimize that. And then if we go to start, we can now open our Deployment Workbench. This is where we're going to import the operating system and create all of our tasks. So if we expand the deployment share, we see we don't have a deployment share yet. So we need to right click it and do new deployment share. Again, by default, it just puts it on C deployment share. Ideally, you put it on a separate data drive, but the C deployment share should work fine. So we'll press next, leave it as the standard deployment share name, and then I'm just going to leave it as the standard MDT deployment share description. Again, with all this, I'm just going to leave it as default because we can specify all these in the task sequence and the settings later. And then next to create the deployment share. that's completed successfully, and just finish. So what that's done is in C, the Windows Deployment Server created the remote install folder, and the deployment share that we just created through the Deployment Workbench now has a folder which will store all of the data. So if we open the deployment share, we can see we've got an applications folder where we'll store all of our applications that we want to install during the process. We've got an operating systems folder for all the operating systems we want to deploy, out-of-box drivers for any drivers that the devices need, any packages that we can create. This is where all the task sequences will be, so the installing the various operating systems and as well as capturing any. We've got the advanced configuration, which we won't go into for this video, and then the monitoring. So to start, we'll go into the operating systems folder and then import a new operating system. Just right click, import operating system. Now there's a couple of options. We can either use the full set of source files. If you've got a custom WIM file or a WIM from a OEM media, you can use that. Or if you've got any images set up in your Windows deployment server, you can import them directly. I'm going to use the full set of source files. Now we need to specify the directory. The easiest way I've found is to get the ISO file, right click and mount. So that's mounted as the E drive, and then browse and just select the E drive and press OK. This will automatically detect everything. So this has automatically detected its enterprise. This is the evaluation, and it is Windows 11. I'm just not sure why it says Windows 10 when it picks it up. I think it's to do with because this is the original enterprise evaluation version. So I'll just change that, and then next, and then next, and this will import all of the files that we need to deploy Windows 11. Now our Windows 11 WIM has been imported. We can just finish to close this wizard, and we can see our file here. It is Windows 11. It's just this is showing Windows 10 because it's the first version. For applications, I'll tell you what, we will just quickly download 7-zip, and we will just add this in, just so you can see the process for installing applications. So I'll just get the 64-bit MSI. What I'll do is just create a folder called 7-zip and move the 7-zip file in there. So then if we go back to our applications, we can do new application, application with source files, and then next we'll give it a name, 7-zip. Ideally you'd fill all this information in, but for the demo I'm not going to. Then select the source files, so we'll just go to downloads and select the 7-zip folder with our 7-zip installation file in there. If you want, you can tell this to move the files instead of copying it to save on storage, but I'm just going to copy it. And then next, directory 7-zip. And then now we need our command. So for this, we will need to use our MSI exec. So MSI exec/I, then the file name, and then /q for quiet install. And then we'll select next, and then next. And then that's imported our application into the Deployment Workbench. Now we need to create a task sequence to actually deploy the operating system. To do that, we can just right click new task sequence and then give it an ID. We'll just call this Win-11, Windows 11 Enterprise. So for the actual task sequence, there are quite a few options, but for this we're just going to use the standard client task sequence, and then we'll do next. Select the Windows 11 Enterprise WIM, and then next. Here, if you've got a specific product key that you want to use, you can specify it here, or if you're just going to attach it to a KMS later, just do not specify, and then next. And then here we can give it a name. We'll just leave that as Windows User. You can change that. Put your organization name, and then if you want, you can specify a website for the homepage. I'm not entirely sure why that's there, but you can specify that if you want. We can give it a local password. Just specify that now, or you can tell it to don't specify one at this time. We'll just specify one and press next, and then next, and then the task sequence has been created. So now we've got our Windows 11 Enterprise task sequence. So we can right click and go to properties, and we can see information about it. We can go into the actual task sequence and see all of the steps. Once you get a bit more familiar, you'll probably be in here quite a lot, creating custom scripts, getting it to do various other bits, but by default it's very good and it gets it all the way to the end and adds it to the domain, so we're just not going to make any changes and leave this as standard. Now we've created the task sequence, we need to make some changes to our deployment share settings. So you can just right click the deployment share and go to properties. What I'm going to do is I'm going to untick the x86 because I don't actually need it. In rules, we're just going to leave these as default for the time being, but we'll change these in a couple of minutes. The same for the Bootstrap INI. Under Windows PE, I'm just going to drop this down and select the x64, and then untick the light touch boot ISO because I don't actually need it to generate the ISO. All we want is to generate the WIM file. So we can import the WIM into our Windows deployment server. If you want, you can generate the ISO boot file and then copy it to a USB and then boot from a USB. And then as long as the machine can see the network, you can do it that way, but I don't really use it that way. And then in monitoring, we will enable the monitoring for the share and then press apply. Now we've applied that settings, what we need to do is right click the deployment share and press update deployment share, and this is where it will generate us a WIM file that we can import into Windows Deployment Services. So what I'm going to do is, because it's the first time, I'm going to completely regenerate the boot image from scratch. You don't have to, you can optimize it, but because that'll do the exact same thing and generate one if it doesn't exist. But I'm just going to do completely regenerate and then press next, and then next to start the regeneration. Now that's finished, I can just press finish. So what that's done is, in our deployment share, in C deployment share, and in boot, it's generated us a light touch WIM file. This is the WIM file we need to import into Windows Deployment Server so that we can boot it to it over the network and then actually start the installation process. So if we go back to Windows Deployment Services, we can expand the server and go to boot images and then right click and add boot image and then browse. In the browse window, we can just go to our deployment share on the C drive, and then go to boot and then select the light touch PE, and then we will open that. And then next, if you want, you can name it, but I'm just going to leave it as the light touch, and then next to actually import it. Now that's imported, I can press finish, and what we can do now is we can actually boot onto the network from a device and then boot into that WIM file. So what I'm going to do is just open up a new virtual machine and then start, and then it should ask us to boot into the network, which it does, and then press enter, and we can see it's booting into this light touch PE64 that we've selected before. So now we're into the actual Microsoft Deployment Toolkit booted over the network. So what we can do is we can run the deployment wizard to install a new operating system, and this will ask us to actually log in. So we just need to log in with credentials that have access to that deployment share. Now what we can do is select the task sequence. There's only one. If you add multiple, they'd all appear here, but we've just created the one task sequence, and then we can press next. And then what we can do is we can basically just follow this wizard through. What I will do is I'll just quickly click through these, but we won't actually start the deployment, and I can show you how to modify the rules so we can skip all of this. So if we wanted, we can migrate some data, select any restore data that we want using the USMT to the migration tools. We can select any regional settings, as well as any applications we want to install. This is just showing the 7-zip because that's the only one we loaded in. If you loaded in more, they'll also appear here. We can also capture any reference images, and then on this will just show us the details. But what I'm going to do is, if we just go back to our deployment server before we start that, and then go back into the Deployment Workbench, and then Properties on the Deployment Share. In these rules, and in the Bootstrap INI, this is where you can specify settings for things to automatically happen. So I've got a default that I use for my Bootstrap, which is this. I'll link all of these in the description if you want to use them. So what this does, this specifies the deployment share, and then it's got the username, the domain, and the password that I want to authenticate with. Ideally, in a production environment, you probably wouldn't have this password because it's stored in plain text, obviously, and you'd want to type that in. But for the lab, it's fine to have it in there. So I'll just save the Bootstrap, and this skip just skips that initial welcome screen as well as sets the keyboard locale. In the rules.ini, I've got this, which basically skips a lot of them screens that I don't need. It tells it to automatically join it to a domain, and the domain I want to join it to, and it specifies the correct OU that I want the machines to go into, as well as the keyboard and time settings, and the monitoring event service. So what I'll do is I'll just apply all these, check that's saved, it did, and then OK. Now anytime you make changes into the rules or the Bootstrap, what you need to do is go back into the deployment share and then update the deployment share. You can either optimize or completely regenerate. I generally just regenerate it, and then next, and then regenerate. Now that's finished, we can just press finish. And I just want to clarify, you only need to update the deployment share is if you make changes to things within the properties. If you add new operating systems or create new task sequences or add applications, you don't need to update that deployment share. You only need to update it when you make changes to the actual share in here. Now that that file has been regenerated, what we need to do is refresh this light touch WIM file. So we can just right click it and do replace image, and then browse, and then it should automatically take us to that C deployment share boot. So we just select this newly regenerated file and press OK, and then you can just next, and to replace it. And now we can finish, because that's finished replacing. So now if we go back into our deployment, and what I'll do is I'll just restart this, actually I'll cancel, I want to cancel, and then I will just restart. So the next time we boot from the network, it will have all settings we just changed to bypass a lot of those windows that I don't need. So what it should do is this should ask us to log in, and a lot of those screens should have gone. There we go. So now it didn't ask us to log in or authenticate, so we can just select the task sequence, and then on the actual task sequence page you can see all this information is pre-filled in. We can just give it a computer name if we want. I'll just give this Win11 deploy. And then on the next pages you can see that it doesn't have all those recovery or backup options. We can just literally select our applications that we want, press next, and it will give us this information. Then we can press begin to automatically deploy Windows 11. And success. The operating system deployment completed successfully. If there are any errors, this shows 0 errors and 0 warnings. There'll either be like a orange or a yellow and a red bar, and it'll tell you where it failed and anything like that. Now we can just finish that, and we should be able to see that it's given the name that we selected, the Windows 10 Win11 deploy. Win11 deploy, it sort of added it to the domain, but we should be logged in with the local administrator account. So all we need to do is switch over to a domain account. What else? 7-zip all apps. We see that 7-zip has deployed as well. So what we can do is if we go back to our deployment server, and then within the deployment workbench we should be able to go to monitoring, and then we can see our Win11 deploy. It took 8 minutes and 40 seconds to do all 90 steps. So basically to go from having a blank hard drive to a fully working Windows 11 system added to the domain, and some software installed in less than 9 minutes. So that is the basics for getting the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit set up and running with Windows deployment services, and to successfully deploy Windows 11 across the network.